I think where we should begin is to talk a little bit about your biography, because I think as much as this book is about Hillary Clinton and her time as Secretary of State, it's also about your experience from Beirut to covering the Secretary of State around the world. So why don't you just begin by talking a little bit about where you came from?
Great. Well, sure. Jamie, first, thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted by your first question because, of course, the biggest star in the book is Hillary Clinton herself. But this isn't just a biography of an historic woman. It's also a different take on the whole issue of American power. And as you mentioned, I come from Beirut. I grew up there. I was born in Beirut in the middle of the Civil War in 1977. And I lived my whole life in Lebanon. First 13 years in war, and then the rest of the time, as some people may know, Beirut is not exactly a stable city. Lebanon is not exactly a stable country. So we've been through many, many ups and downs, and I lived through all of them, which gives you a very interesting take on the world, on America's position on the global stage. And the first sentence of my book is, I grew up in Beirut on the front lines of a civil war, and my father always said, if America wanted the conflict to end, it would be over tomorrow. So it sort of frames the whole discussion about what is America. What can it do? How much power does it really have? And to try to find the balance between this illusion of how much power America actually has and what is really happening on the ground. So that kind of frames the discussion. But I lived in Beirut my whole life. I became a journalist there. Living through war is what drove me to become a journalist. I was always keen to understand the chaos around me, understand why I had to live through what I was living alongside the other 4 million Lebanese who were there. I covered the Middle East extensively, Syria, which unfortunately is going through its own terrible conflict at the moment, Saudi Arabia, Iraq. And then I applied for a BBC job to cover the State Department. I was already their correspondent in Beirut. I was writing for others as well, but I was doing more and more for the BBC, and I eventually applied for the State Department job, which I thought was an amazing opportunity for me to see another perspective on what I had been covering in the Middle East. Obviously, I knew a lot about the US. I traveled there. I've been here on holiday. I have an American brother-in-law. But it just gives you a front row seat to the other side of the story.
And you were if I'm not mistaken, the only non-American foreign correspondent in the traveling press corps for the State Department. Is that right?
That is correct. Although my colleagues from Agence France Presse and Reuters may want to point out that they are non-American, but I'm also non-Western. Yeah. I have a Dutch mother, but for all intents and purposes, I'm very much an Arab woman. I grew up there I lived there my whole life, and that's kind of what I bring to the table. Although I have, of course, also a Western perspective on some things because of my background, my mother's nationality, and the time I've spent traveling in the West. But yes, I was the only non-Western, and specifically for the BBC, the first non-British person to cover this beat.
I think one of the most interesting parts of the book is actually learning the process of being Secretary of State, going from country to country, and you kind of take us there as Hillary Clinton traveled all around the world. So let me just talk a little bit about process and ask you about that. When the book opens in the first chapter after the introduction, and you're with the traveling press corps, and Hillary Clinton comes in for the first time, and you mention that the press is starstruck with her. Do you think that affected the coverage in any way? That she was such a big figure that they were trying to hold back a little bit?
I don't think so. No, I really don't think so. There was this moment that is inevitable when someone with her celebrity status walks into a room, and it applies to world leaders as well. It's not just us journalists. And of course, just to reassure the viewers, there was no clapping because there was a lot of clapping when she walked into the building for the first day, her first day on the job. There was this instant of being a little bit starstruck because she is Hillary Clinton. Not all of us had ever had met her in the past, so there is that first moment of, you know, wow, Hillary Clinton is there. But then it's immediately followed by, okay, you know, what are the tough questions that we want to ask her? And we certainly didn't shy away from asking those questions throughout her tenure, both for myself when I interviewed her. We've had some very tough exchanges, but always very, very fair and very much designed to broaden the conversation and further the understanding about the issues. And also there was a little bit of wariness on both sides because she hasn't had necessarily, to put it mildly, a great relationship with the media. So she was a little bit wary of us, you know, who was this new press pack who was going to cover her, you know, how were they going to write their stories? And we were wondering, you know, how is this going to work? This is a political personality that suddenly arrives in a very wonkish world of diplomacy where every comma matters, where it's all about the nuances. How is this going to work? So there was also a certain degree of wariness when she arrived, because she also brought with her, you know, a little bit of the Hillary land, as it was dubbed when she was at the White House.
And as I said, I was intrigued by the fast pace of these trips. One day you're in Islamabad, next day you're in the United Arab Emirates, and you're constantly traveling. There's this book, as you mentioned, that's constantly updated with where they're going and information. But there is really, it seems like, little time to actually digest what you just did and where you're going next. And even in the midst of one trip, I think you mentioned in one instance, they're planning a trip to Latin America in 2 weeks. Is this good? I mean, is it good to be this fast-paced? Should there be more time to digest what's going on? I mean, isn't this how mistakes would be made?
Let me first tell you about what it was like for me to follow her. I mean, obviously, yes, it is very fast-paced, and unfortunately, it's the nature of the world that we live in. You don't have the luxury to sit back and press pause on world events and say, let me first digest what happened in Syria before I turn my attention to Pakistan. It's kind of why I wanted to write the book. Obviously, I'm a journalist covering daily news, whether it's on the road with the Secretary of State or here in Washington where I cover foreign policy. And that's what motivated me to write The Secretary, to sort of take a step back and digest everything I had seen, everything I had learned. I had learned a lot being in this front row seat to history, to diplomacy, watching all those different events unfold. And writing the book was a very maturing experience as well, as I digested, as you say, some of what I had seen and try to come to some of the conclusions that I was trying to get at. But when it comes to the Secretary of State and the people around her, I think that what I found striking is her ability to stay focused at all times, as much as possible, on what is happening. She doesn't get distracted by the details if they're not important. Obviously, details often matter, but she has an ability to stay focused on the big picture. How is what is happening in Afghanistan impacting what they might be doing in the Middle East? How is what is happening in the Middle East impacting what they're trying to do in Asia? I think she had a good sense of what is the big picture, what is the strategy here. And of course, she's surrounded by people who are helping her. You know, I have to carry my own suitcase, but you know, she has staff, and that allows her, and I talk about that a little bit, that allows her to stay focused on what really matters. She doesn't have to worry about whether lunch is going to be served or not. It'll just arrive, and when it arrives, she'll have it while she's thinking about the bigger picture. But of course, I think mistakes do happen, and I think that's inevitable. But it's also important to acknowledge that. And that's part of what motivated me to write the book, not just for an audience in the US, but for an audience around the world who have this impression that America is this, you know, all-knowing power that has the answers to everything, has all the facts, and has a foolproof plan for everything. It doesn't work like that. America's run by fallible human beings who don't have all the facts, don't always have all the answers, and are trying to do the best they can. And sometimes it doesn't work out.
And I want to explore that later, because I think that's one of the most interesting parts of the book, is the question of America's role in the world. But I think maybe we should turn to maybe some of the examples and some of the countries that you traveled to and what it felt. And I think there's probably no better place to start than Beirut. They traveled there early on, and you did with the Secretary of State. What was that like, returning to Beirut as part of an American delegation in a way? You weren't part of the delegation, but you were covering it. You were in the convoys. You said you used to watch and be a little bit annoyed about when you were a child in Beirut and growing up in Beirut. What was that like?
It was very unsettling. And writing that chapter was the first time I really said very much about it. It was the first time that I put into words how I felt about being there. As you mentioned, yes, growing up in Beirut, there were often mixed feelings about the United States, whether for me or others in Lebanon. I grew up in an environment where